Hello everyone and welcome to the episode series on the Great Revolt, Episode 1, The Traitor Who Wrote History and the Secret of National Existence. We're unpacking Dr. Michael Ben-Hari's book today, and it seriously flips the script on the Jewish revolt against Rome. For generations, this massive first-century uprising has been brushed off as a disastrous march of folly. But in this explainer, we're going to look past the standard history books and dig into the actual motivations behind this monumental struggle for national survival. The author opens with this incredibly powerful imagined scene. Picture it. Exhausted, chained Jewish rebel leaders locked in iron cages on a ship in Caesarea, heading for a Roman triumph. And standing right in front of them, Flavius Josephus, a guy who used to be their comrade, an actual commander in the revolt who defected to the Romans. In this scene, rebel leader Shimon Bar Jora curses Josephus as a miserable traitor. Josephus just smiles and drops this chilling line. The memory belongs to whoever will write the history. And it's true, right? These rebels were heading to their brutal deaths, while Josephus was off to a comfy desk in Rome to write the only surviving historical account of the war. It really makes you wonder just how much of the history we accept as absolute fact was written by the very people who betrayed it.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, the traitor who wrote history. Second, anatomy of gradual subjugation. Third, the logic of rebellion. Then, opposing the uprising. And finally, engine of the revolt.
Section 1. The Traitor Who Wrote History. Let's look at the deep historical injustice that Dr. Ben-Hari argues was committed here. Just look at this stark contrast in fates. On one hand, you've got heroic fighters who refuse to surrender, meeting brutal ends. Killed, sold into slavery, or thrown to wild beasts in arenas for entertainment. On the other hand, you have Josephus. He secures Roman protection, gets patronage from the Flavian dynasty, and literally writes a narrative painting these freedom fighters as just criminals, robbers, and violent zealots. The text makes a strong case that for thousands of years, scholars have been totally misled by Josephus's malicious spin. Basically, we've allowed a traitor to define the legacy of people who sacrificed everything for their nation's freedom.
Moving on to Section 2, Anatomy of Gradual Subjugation.
To really get why this revolt wasn't just some sudden fit of madness, but a calculated, necessary response, we have to look at how Roman oppression actually worked. It didn't just start with mass executions. Dr. Ben-Hari draws a fascinating parallel to biblical slavery in Egypt. Think about it. Pharaoh didn't just wake up one day and start throwing children into the river. It was methodical. Step 1, incitement and hostility. Step 2, slap on heavy taxes and discriminatory laws. Step 3, physical slavery. And then finally, outright murder. It's a gradual approach completely designed to strip a nation of its identity piece by piece, turning proud citizens into pacified subjects without sparking an immediate desperate rebellion.
The author even pulls from modern history to really hammer this point home, pointing to the absolutely deceptive slogans the Nazis used at Auschwitz. By slapping "work sets you free" on the gates of a death camp, oppressors are intentionally weaponizing false hope. It's that tragic illusion of, hey, if we just comply, if we just work hard enough, maybe we'll survive. That illusion is exactly what prevents an immediate uprising. The argument here is that if a nation is fully aware of its liberty, without all these deceptive middle stages, they're naturally going to resist and choose death over subjugation.
That brings us to Section 3, the logic of rebellion. So if fighting the Roman superpower meant almost certain death and the destruction of Jerusalem, why do it? Well, the author directly takes on modern critics of the revolt here. Take Israeli writer Meir Shalev, who's quoted framing the uprising as a catastrophic error, a march of folly pushed by violent extremists with messianic delusions. Critics like Shalev often argue that the true reason Judaism survived in exile was through moderation and compromise, basically the path taken by the folks who surrendered or fled. But Dr. Ben-Hari totally flips this critique on its head. He argues this modern view comes from a worldview completely lacking in ultimate values. He poses a really piercing question. Is physical survival always preferable to national freedom? To him, the people mocking the rebels as madmen are just failing to comprehend a value system where preserving the soul and liberty of a nation actually matters more than just staying alive as a subjugated slave. The text draws a fascinating line between a physical victory and a spiritual one. A united rebellion, even if it ends in total physical destruction, can still be an enormous victory of the spirit. He compares the Great Revolt to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in World War II. Look, everybody knew the Warsaw fighters couldn't militarily defeat the Nazi army. That was a guaranteed military defeat. But today, nobody calls the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising a march of folly. We revere it as a monumental victory of the human spirit. And Dr. Ben-Ari argues the Great Revolt functioned exactly the same way. It was a spiritual victory that was absolutely necessary to preserve the nation's ethos of liberty for future generations.
Let's jump into Section 4, Opposing the Uprising. Because, let's be real, revolts almost never have unanimous support. When a society faces down an empire, there's always going to be intense internal pushback. The author breaks this internal opposition down into 4 distinct groups. First, the folks who just accept reality. They're used to the oppression and terrified of changing the status quo. Second, you've got the elites, the wealthy who are way more scared of losing their property and status than they are eager for freedom. Third are the realists. These guys focus purely on the military risks and the statistical impossibility of winning, which completely saps the morale of the fighters. And finally, the outright traitors, who actively defect and aid the enemy just to save their own skin. As the text points out, dealing with this fractured internal front is usually the hardest part of any struggle for independence.
And finally, Section 5, Engine of the Revolt. So what actually drove these fighters? How did they find the willpower to face down the unstoppable Roman war machine, especially with all that internal division and impossible odds? The author calls this engine the messianic idea. Now, modern critics love to throw the word messianic around as an insult, like it just means madness or being totally irrational, but the text frames it completely differently. Here, the messianic idea is this profound, deep-seated faith that when a nation is fighting a justified war for freedom against an evil superpower, they can expect divine assistance to help them beat the odds. It's the exact same logic that had the biblical David facing Goliath with nothing but a sling, or the Maccabees taking on the Greeks. The author's point is that without this deeply rooted faith, without that willingness to leap into the unknown for a higher purpose, a nation is never going to rise up and claim its liberty. It wasn't madness at all. It was literally the secret to their national existence.
It definitely leaves you thinking, if history is always written by the victors, or in this case the defectors, what other historical marches of folly are actually forgotten victories of the spirit? Thank you for being with us. See you in the next episode in the series on the Great Revolt.